Sorry about that. Oh, here we go. But the museum includes mummies and all sorts of artifacts, Roman, Egyptian, Greek, Chinese. This, by the way, is the Babylonian stela that has the Code of Hammurabi, whatever you say. Now, that's not the actual original, it's a duplicate, if that makes sense. I don't know how they did that, because it's a rock, some kind of, notice there's the code. There's at least 450 laws on there. It's supposedly the earliest book of law or collection of laws that we have. So that's kind of cool.
Where's the original?
I don't know. I think Paris, but I'm not sure. Pretty neat, though. But these are all homemade videos that I made there. And the one image is of Akhenaten. Here they are. So here's an actual collection of artifacts from Egypt that include this. These are all on Akhenaten's period. And you'll notice, see, there's the rays. That's Akhenaten worshiping the sun and the rays, etc. And it's very identifiable because he had a defect. His body was oddly shaped. I believe they argue he had prune belly syndrome or something of that sort. So his waist was unusual. So you can see he was depicted that way. In any case, so you could see all sorts of things in the museums, which is. But as I was saying, that seemed to have been the first monotheistic religion, as far as we know. I also think it has to do with mathematics, that if you have mathematics, for the first time, the idea that someone can believe something is true and someone believes something else is true, and you might not even feel like there's a contradiction involved. As the Romans famously said, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, which I think was the idea that you change your beliefs when you go from one community to the next to get along with whatever that group is, right? It doesn't really matter. But once you have mathematics, there's right answers. So 2 + 2 = 4, and you can't say it's 5 sometimes. No, that just doesn't work. And so when you're using mathematics and you say there's a greatest God, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, that's the absolute best one, right? Well, you can only have one of those. Right? You might still believe in all the other ones that have moderate power of some sort or another. When we, of course, think of those that fled Egypt. And by the way, to tie that in, when Akhenaten was killed, there's some will argue that that's when his followers fled, following his high priest, who may have been Moses. So that's kind of interesting if you're into that. That Moses led the followers and the slaves, Hebrews, out of Egypt and established another kingdom where they were monotheists. And initially they still believed that there were other gods. They were just under a contract with that one particular God. That was their God. They were the chosen people of that God. And you shouldn't, worship the other ones, just that one, right? But it gradually evolved and became initially it became the god of the vacant seat. So you couldn't make images of the god. Of course, there were lots of images of lots of gods, but you couldn't make an image of that god because it was so powerful that you couldn't kind of trap it into a particular place. Well, you could. They could still have it in a particular place, and that's why they would carry the ark around, because the god was kind of co-located with that ark. If you're familiar with, right, how that worked. But in any case, the next evolution, and notice this is an evolution narrative associated with how our understanding of God developed, would be Christianity. And Christianity adds to the concept of the monotheistic position that there is a human being who is also co-eternal with God, right? Jesus, right? And so that's the next evolutionary step, supposedly, right? Islam, when it comes roughly around, 620 AD, is considered, of course, by Europeans as a retreat, a step backwards, because for Islam, Allah is the only God. There's no, it was a critique of the very complex trinity of Byzantium at the time, right? And so you ended up with Islam, in that view, being a regressive religion as opposed to a progressive religion. But for Western Europe, the next advance would be Protestantism, where instead of Jesus being only able to communicate with everyone through the priesthood or through the church, with Protestantism, Martin Luther argues that each of us can have a direct relationship with Jesus. That's just a brief, right? So when we look at Hegel, who was a Lutheran, and argued that this is, of course, not saying that God is evolving, because God always is, always, or God always was, always will be, always remains the same, right? So God itself doesn't change, but our understanding of God evolves. And so, in that sense, with Jesus, our conception of God evolves to the point where God is self-aware, because Jesus knows that he is God, right? And he's a human being, and so humans know that God cares for us. It becomes anthropocentric, right? So the view is not that God is out there, independent of our interests, but instead is very much interested in humans, right? You could argue that the Jewish religion argues the same too, but I don't know how much influence Christianity had backwards on a lot of Judaism, I don't know. But once Hegel argues that the real evolutionary step then is when each of us ends up being able to communicate with God. That's the highest point in the development of religion, revealed religion for Hegel, right? And by the way, that's coincidental with the idea of the modern self. And remember, the essential ingredient there is that individuals are self-reflective and think of themselves as Hamlet does, right? As a self that's got to make decisions and so on. And in that sense, we're also able to communicate with God, etc. So that's just kind of a basic. And by the way, when we were talking about Nietzsche, I think someone asked about capitalism. Was that here? Someone asked about capitalism. I should have mentioned that Max Weber, in his book, Protestantism or Capitalism and the Protestant Work Ethic, argues that it's the Protestant Northern European, where mostly the Protestants were, right, that developed capitalism, and that's that real connection there. And then there's an interesting point that Jennifer, the professor that I showed a short video of, she argues that one of the Catholic theologians that was arguing against Nietzsche pointed out that Nietzsche is really an extreme example of Protestantism. And the problem, of course, is that you have so many choices as a Protestant, and if you had avoided Protestantism and remained Catholic, then you wouldn't have all those choices, and you wouldn't have that difficulty in deciding which religion to believe in. You'd have been Catholic, right? And of course, that would have kept you from feeling like you were God and that you made you get to make all the choices. So it's kind of interesting how that ties in. I'm going to go back now and play this. This is How to Read a Cathedral.
Justification. Well, first of all, let's look at the architectural structure.
Since I had selected Anselm, I thought I should do some stuff from the Middle Ages. I also picked Hildegard.
There's nothing as lovely as the sight of the Gothic cathedral facade. So we go, oh, that's nice. And then we wander into the cathedral. But are we missing something? The Gothic facade had a set of very specific meanings to the medieval viewer, particularly if you were an educated man. Women tended not to be educated, particularly not in theology, which you'll have to understand to make sense of some of the imagery here. So what I'm going to do quickly here is to give you a whirlwind tour of the Gothic facade, explaining some of those meanings. And I'm going to focus on the French Gothic. The same rules are true for Gothic styles in other countries, but there are local differences. For instance, in England, the facades are longer, wider, flatter, and were completely covered with sculpture, like this one at Salisbury, while in France, the sculpture was usually restricted just to the porches. Well, first of all, let's look at the architectural structure, because that has some meaning in itself. Here's Notre Dame de Paris, the quintessential Gothic facade, twin towers and a rose window. If you look at Amiens, Lens, Reims, you'll get an impression that the French cathedral doesn't change much. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and Orleans has two little wedding cake spirals, but otherwise it's still recognisably the Gothic breastplate. Then, if we look at Amiens from the side, we can see these huge porches. They are another standard feature of the French Gothic. There are 3 doors, going into the nave in the centre and the aisles at each side. Okay, but Bourges there are 5 doors because the cathedral's got 5 aisles, but that's an exception. And each door has a huge gable on top of it. And again, if you look at other cathedrals, Paris, or Reims, or Lens, you'll see a similar layout. And the doors are where the sculpture really goes to town. This is where the theology comes in. Now, the Gothic cathedral is a work of art that's really trying to be an encyclopedia. It's trying to include everything inside it. And Gothic art loves lists. So we get complete sets, like trading cards, top trumps. We get the virtues and vices, showing you how to behave properly. We get the labours of the months, showing the seasons of the agricultural year. We get sections, the 12 apostles, and the Old Testament prophets. And so it goes. Now usually, each doorway shows us a different view of the universe. For instance, the north door is where we usually see the local saint, and the ladies of the months come in here. This is the door that relates to our everyday world, the world we actually live in, day to day. And then under the middle door, we'll probably see the Last Judgment, with Jesus at the top, and the corpses rising out of the tombs at the bottom, ready to be judged. We can see St. Michael weighing souls in balance, and we can see the blessed souls in the bosom of Abraham, and the damned souls consigned to the mouth of hell or boiling in cauldrons. And if you look up into the arch above the door, you can see the orders of angels, saints, and sometimes you can see the elders of the apocalypse, 24 men, usually old men, usually bearded, and always playing musical instruments. They're part of the apocalypse, the story of the last days, and for some reason they're always shown here, while we hardly ever see the riders of the apocalypse on their 4 horses. Then the south door will often be dedicated to the Virgin Mary, so here we'll see stories of her life, or perhaps episodes from Jesus' childhood, like the visit of the 3 kings, or the flight to Egypt. Sometimes the pattern varies, for instance, where the cathedral is dedicated to the Virgin, sometimes she gets the middle door instead. And then running across the whole facade, we might see column figures like these at Chartres, probably the earliest step. And at Amiens, the whole story of the Bible is splayed across the front. There are the prophets, there are the apostles, and even Solomon, the Queen of Sheba. Now we've been looking at the ground level for a while, but look up, and there's a rose window. From the earliest and most simple style, this is the one that's long, to the most complex, flamboyant work like this one at the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, the rose window is a feature of all the great Gothic cathedrals. To the Middle Ages, the circle represented a perfect form. It was a symbol of eternity. And so we have eternity at the top of the facade. Then we have the tympanos of the doors showing the life of Jesus, the Last Judgment, the life of the Virgin, the life of the saint. And then at the bottom we have the church and sacred history from the Bible, showing God's providence at work. And then, leading directly into our own lives, we can see the labours of the month, the virtues and vices, scenes of everyday life. So all the way from God and mathematical abstraction right down to killing a pig for the Christmas feast, it's all there. And it's an encyclopedia of how the medieval architect would have seen the sacred universe of God at the top and men at the bottom, and all of the saints and prophets in between. You don't have to be a Christian to find that a compelling vision. Everything is here and everything is in its place. So next time you look at the Gothic facade, you'll understand a bit more about what it would have meant to its medieval audience. And you know what? It will still look beautiful.
Very informative, I think, however. So, we could play more with this argument, but I would like to move on to other examples of the Middle Ages or medieval period. Besides Anselm, we also have Hildegard von Bingen, who is a terrific example of a nun who's about the same time period, 1098 to 1179. And she's famous not only for her music. I don't know if you've ever heard any of her music. I was playing some earlier. I can put some on again. There's lots of different recordings. There's movies about her also. I think there was even a German TV show about her. So she led a pretty amazing life. She was a young girl when she had dreams that she was being visited by the Blessed Mother. And her mother took her to the local bishop to see what was wrong. And the bishop concluded that she was actually seeing the Blessed Mother, so they took her away from her mother. And along with another girl, the two of them were locked in a room, stone wall in, except for a little window where they could be passed food each day. It was in the cathedral, so looking out that little window, they could hear the nuns singing while they were, and that was the only thing they could actually experience, what was going on through that little window, till they were old enough that then they let them out. Yeah, that sounds absolutely horrible. Can you imagine? And at that point, then she became a nun herself, went through the stages of becoming a nun herself, eventually became the abbess of more than one abbey. Bingen was one of them, and so that's why she's Hildegard von Bingen, because she was the head of that abbey. But she lived quite old, I think in her 80s, and she would disagree with the authorities. I remember one of the things that she's famous for was one of her parish families, the wife died. She and her husband had been married for many years, and when she had died and they buried her, the husband was very upset with God and basically ostracized himself because of his fury from the church. And then when he died, because the husband had behaved that way, the authorities said he wasn't allowed to be buried in holy ground next to his wife, and Hildegard, screw you, she put him right next to his wife. So that's kind of interesting. But if you look up, let me see if I could find You guys enjoying this, by the way? Is this fun?
In der Regel heißt es, dass die Schwestern selber wählen, wer sie leitet.
Das gilt für ein Frauenkloster. Ihr lebt hier in einem Gemeinschaftskloster und hier habe ich zu bestimmen.
Ich kann die Wahl nur annehmen.
So here's a whole movie on her life. One difficulty, though, is if you've noticed, it's in German. Sorry about that. But, so, lots of those. Other really famous individuals.
Unsere großen Heiligen waren sehr oft von Krankheit befallen. Und geistlich.
So this, if I find it, is a movie about St. Francis of Assisi and Clare. There's some really beautiful little bits in it. The movie is called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. That's Clare. This was a movie made by Franco Zeffirelli, the same producer who produced the famous movie Romeo and Juliet, which has a lot of similar costumes and and the composer of the music was Nina Rota, who also did the music for that movie. I think they did a lot together. And this was when I was a kid, and this is kind of like the hippie movie. So it depicted St. Francis as kind of a hippie, which all of us were, I don't know if I was a hippie, but we all cut our hair that way. But St. Francis rebelled against the church. There were lots of those, actually. It wasn't, of course, until Martin Luther rebelled against the church that you ended up with a Reformation. But all of those that led previous rebellions basically created a new order. So in this case, they were the Franciscans, followers of St. Francis. The followers of Ignatius Loyola started the Jesuits, the Benedictines, Benedict, obviously. So you've got lots of these different orders. There was also the Augustinians, followers of St. Augustine. And the reason it's an order is they have a rule, they have a list of orders that you must follow in order to be a member. Usually things like a vow of poverty, so you give up the desire to have property, which, by the way, always caused problems, because eventually the order would become powerful enough that it had its own property, and that of course was enough to enable corruption in the order itself, which of course is what they were trying to avoid. Okay, so there's that. There's others that were not monks originally stealing heaven. Is such a movie. Hopefully I picked a safe.
This will be my own holy day, and I proclaim this to be a holy day, because I can never be happier than I am. Never, ever.
So, this is about Abelard and Heloise. Abelard, of course, is not a saint. Main reason for it is he ended up becoming a monk because he sinned. And as a result of let me explain. He was a teacher in Paris, famous for that, mostly teaching logic. As a teacher, he wasn't very rich, of course. He just got money from the students that paid to come and listen to him. So a baron in Paris asked him to move into his castle, and he could live there for free, room and board. All he needed to do was give his ward, the baron's ward, Heloise, to teach her. He did a terrific job teaching her. She became pregnant. The problem was, of course, as a teacher, he couldn't get married because he'd be out of work, because you weren't allowed to marry. On the other hand, the baron insisted that he marry his ward since she was pregnant. Since he was hesitant, the baron became furious and sent 4 of his henchmen to his... He stayed in the castle That's pretty dumb, don't you think? And so the Baron sent 4 henchmen in who removed the offending member of his body, after which he decided, well, there's no point in not being a monk anymore. So he became a monk, and Heloise became a nun after she had her child, whom they named, by the way, what's the name of the nautical instrument that you could use to figure out where you were? I can't think of the name of it offhand. Pardon? Not the compass. It was the. It was similar to that, but there was a name. I can't think of it offhand. But got to be careful here, because remember, it's a European movie, so there's an awful lot of parts of the movie spent on their relationship and that sort of thing. In any case, once her baby was born, she went and became a nun, and she ran the convent that was right next to the monastery that he ran. So that's kind of... So there's lots of stuff. And what I'd like to argue is that the Middle Ages were not dark. There's a lot of stuff that happened. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to live during that time period. If you've ever visited the castles in Europe, especially the old medieval ones, and not like the relatively modern ones like Neuschwanstein and the ones that crazy Ludwig built in Bavaria. But if you visit the castles, their heating system was next to zilch or filthy. You know, it was basically fireplaces that didn't have outlets, so the smoke was all in the room. You had the walls were just stone, and so that's why a lot of the walls were covered with the tapestries. That was their insulation, not just something to make the room more beautiful, but they literally had the tapestries. By the way, there's a tapestry of William the Conqueror's victory. What? We lost it. Oh well. But it's just fun. But the places were miserable. I remember in one castle in Germany, we were walking around up in the top where it was the nobles' quarters, basically, and I saw this one white tunnel, not tunnel, but like hallway. It just went to a dead end, and I was wondering, what the heck is that? And so I walked to the end, and I saw there was like a wooden bench there. No window or anything, just this wooden bench. Well, I lifted up the seat, and I realized that I was looking out the toilet, and the hole that you would sit on looked straight down into the moat. So I was thinking, well, that's pretty crappy, you know. And especially if you're under siege, you know, and there's a bowman down there, you know, it might be a race, you know. So, pretty interesting. So no, I wouldn't want to have lived there. Of course, they had plagues and everything else, but there were happy people there. One of the neat things about Abelard and Heloise was that while they were separate from one another, they wrote letters back and forth to one another. And we had those letters in the library in English, so you can read them, and you can see that they were pretty happy. He was one of the reasons he was such a popular teacher was he was sort of like a Beatle. You know, the musicians, you know, I think he sang while he was teaching, so it was like fun to go and listen to, etc. Well, I need to give you a quiz question. I know in the tests I ask you what you think of the ontological argument, so I won't ask that. So what's a good quiz question? Okay, so here's something that I didn't mention, but I should have, and that's Kurt Gödel. I mentioned his ontological proof, right? One of the other things that Gödel is famous for is his incompleteness theorem. And the incompleteness theorem demonstrates that mathematical systems, arithmetic, for example, can be complete, can be coherent, but they can't be proved to be coherent. And there are statements in those systems that have to be true in the system, but that cannot be demonstrated to be true in the system. These are the axioms. Right? In order for you to use mathematics or arithmetic, you have to believe in the axioms, but those axioms cannot be demonstrated as true in the system. In other words, you need faith in order to use the system. You have to have faith in the axioms. Those cannot be proved, but you must accept them. So you need both faith and reason. So what's a good question? Based on that, are there things that you feel are axiomatic? Things that are absolutely true? What axioms do you believe are true? For example, 0 is a number. What kind of examples do I have? So for example, Peano's axioms. So these are the axioms of arithmetic. 0 is a number. If A is a number, the successor of A is a number, etc. So here's examples of axioms. You can't do arithmetic unless you believe these axioms, but guess what? You cannot prove that these axioms are true. So even arithmetic, you have to have faith. You see where that might be an issue in today's society? Yes. Fun. Questions? Anybody have a question? Why is it cold? Because of global warming. Just in case you didn't know. Be safe out there. Watch. I saw fresh moose tracks around the library yesterday. So there are moose in the neighborhood, and they're very hard to see if you're not used to them. You could walk right by those very large animals and not even notice them. I've seen students walk right by moose within feet of them and not realize the moose was there. So normally today, I think the campus police try to know where the moose are and kind of hang around and make sure people don't walk near the moose. Because they have actually injured people, of course. You know, that happens. So be safe out there. See you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend. Be safe. Happy Valentine's Day.